was going to introduce you.
Go ahead.
I was going to make sure it comes up. So our speaker today is Anne Krendl. I have known Anne for far too long. 14 years, if you do the math.
Yeah.
14 years.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
That is far too long, Dylan.
So that means I know a lot about Anne that I can tell you about. But I'll leave a couple of things out. So Anne got her PhD at Dartmouth in 2008. She did her postdoc at Tufts with the late and great Nalini Ambati. And then after that, she moved on to IU, where she directs the Neuroimaging of Mind and Behavior Lab, or NOMBLE?
Nimble.
Yeah,
I get attitude about that.
And so what's really great about Anne, and one of the joys, I guess, of knowing her all these years, is to see just the wide swath of social cognition and social neuroscience research that she's done. She's conducted things on many, many different topics, starting out by doing some of the first neuroimaging work on stereotype threat, moving through to studying stigmas of many different kinds. And then for her PhD, she started to do work on aging and looking at sort of age-related changes in social cognition with some neuroimaging work. And I remember knowing her and being around her at the time thinking this is madness because we have a hard enough time recruiting undergraduates. And as I'm sure many people here know, older adults are cyborgs. I just remember Anne really struggling with recruitment, but at the end of the day, getting just a ton of subjects, which I think sort of speaks to her diligence and work ethic, at least back then. Since then, she's continued to do great work, looking, she just spoke to us this morning in the social area about mental health stigma, showing really neat work that they're doing now on cross-cultural differences in mental health stigma, as well as really neat work looking at how they can change mental health stigma on campuses with really sort of creative and large interventions. But what she's going to talk to us today is some more recent work looking at, again, age-related changes in social cognition, but now sort of relating it to changes in network architecture. And my understanding is this is work in collaboration with Olaf Sporns, who we got to see at the end of last academic year. So it should be really neat work, very amenable to a lot of what people are doing here. And so please join me in welcoming Anne Krendl.
Thank you for that, Dylan, and for the wonderful hosting. And thank you guys so much for having me. This is really a great opportunity to talk about some newer directions that my lab has been going into, trying to understand changes in social cognition that happen with aging, really through a lens of a network neuroscience approach. And I always like to point out, especially when I speak to a neuroimaging department, that, while it's great that you guys have, your vibrant city and your great football team and everything here at OSU, we do have the world's largest anatomically correct limestone carving of a human brain. So, mic drop, I think we're done right now. The work I'm going to talk to you about today is all work that was actually spearheaded by my graduate student Colleen Hughes, who I understand will be talking to you guys in about 2 weeks. And it stemmed from just some years of persistent stalking and nagging that I was doing of this lovely man, Olaf Sporns, who I know many of you got to meet last spring, who is really not only the pioneer of this field of network neuroscience, but perhaps one of the nicest human beings I've ever encountered. And I became really interested in trying to use a network neuroscience approach to think about changes in social cognition and aging beyond kind of the typical GLM measures that people really traditionally use in this field. And Olaf got really excited about this, and so we brought in his graduate student and his postdoc, and my former postdoc, Brittany Cassidy, to do a lot of the work that you're going to see happening today. And I put this disclaimer up here because I hope that it comes through that I didn't do the network neuroscience part of this, so I'm going to walk you through what we did and the level at which I talk to you about it is the level at which I understand it. So your nitty-gritty questions about it, feel free to harass Colleen with it and test her knowledge. She's got to defend her dissertation soon enough, so make sure she deserves it and get back to me. All right, so cognitive decline has been noted across multiple domains in aging. So people will talk about changes in executive function, in attention and learning and memory, of course, that are associated with aging. But I'm really interested in this domain of social cognition. And how age-related changes that are happening just as part of healthy aging. So today I'm just going to talk to you about healthy aging, but at the end I'm going to kind of tease a little bit of future directions that we're looking toward that are more related to pathological aging. but we're really interested in understanding just how healthy aging is affecting a lot of really core social cognitive processes. And the one I'm going to mostly focus on today is something called theory of mind. So theory of mind, it really is one of the fundamentally most key skills that people need to maintain social relationships. So I'm just going to start with this really hand-wavy overview that turns out social relationships are important. There's a lot of work done, particularly with older adults, and the late John Cacioppo did a lot of this really nice work looking at loneliness as one of the most sort of pernicious types of things that older adults face, and has a lot of negative outcomes for older adults about their mental and physical health. And so having good social relationships is very protective and important for older adults, and for younger adults as well, but I'm going to focus sort of on the other end of the lifespan. And this core part of maintaining a good relationship requires theory of mind. So theory of mind is just defined as the ability to accurately infer others' mental or emotional states. I have my little example here of my cartoon. I wouldn't have taken 1,000 selfies if I didn't know you wouldn't want to see them all. So it's this idea with theory of mind that you should be able to understand that other people see the world differently than you do. So the example I really like to give about theory of mind is a true story from one of my colleagues who is not a neuroimaging colleague. Olaf now, I think, is going to make me say that so you don't think that it was him. But he had a speaker who came to visit IU at one point, and after the speaker finished his talk, he told my colleague he was thirsty, so my colleague said, sure, let's go up to my office, I'll get you a drink. We walk into his office, sit down, and my colleague walks over to a shelf full of water bottles like this that are various stages of full. And he pulls one down and offers it to the speaker, and the speaker balks and doesn't want to drink it, doesn't want the water bottle. And my colleague can't understand. He said he was thirsty. I offered him a bottle of water. Why didn't he want it? And a few of you are smirking because you have theory of mind. And you understand that what happened was that the speaker assumed that my colleague had taken the bottles of water and he had opened the bottles of water. He'd consumed some and put it on a shelf. And who wants to drink that? But my colleague actually had opened them and poured the water out and had consumed it that way. And he knew he did that. So he didn't, but he just couldn't understand that the other person didn't see it that way. And that's just a failure of theory of mind. So it's not understanding that other people don't know what you know and make different assumptions that you do. And kind of correcting for those errors is really critical for maintaining really good social relationships. And this is why theory of mind is often talked about in things like it facilitates a variety of things like deceptive detection, avoiding social gaffes like that one, understanding other people's emotions. This is one thing people talk a lot about in autism. So sort of a hallmark of autism is that in a lot of the early work on autism was looking at people with, especially people who were very high on the spectrum, have very poor theory of mind, so they can't understand that other people see things differently than they do. So it's a really important social skill. And it turns out that older adults are not good at it. So these are the results of a meta-analysis from about 40-ish studies looking at theory of mind amongst older adults. And I'm showing you, I hate showing tables, I'm sorry, this is just what the paper happened to have. But the main thing I want you to see is that across all studies and all different types of theory of mind, there are lots of ways to measure theory of mind. But looking at dynamic stimuli, visual stimuli, verbal stimuli, all those different ways older adults show these impairments on theory of mind. And what this is showing you is one of the few graphs they have in this meta-analysis. What it's showing you is the effect size for older adults across all of these different studies. And so what it's showing you is this is the mean effect size right here, which is negative, so older adults are showing impairments. And what it's showing you is just kind of how each study relates to this baseline. So the 0 line is here, so anything above this line would mean better theory of mind with age. But what I want you to notice is that most of these dots here are below this line. So older adults tend to have very impaired theory of mind, which is why this becomes a question that's interesting to us. And typically when people do studies on aging, and particularly in social cognition, this is a very new field. Very few people have been doing work looking at social neuroscience and aging. And the traditional approach is the GLM approach. So you have these are data from a study that we ran, and actually the studies I'm going to show you today are from, this is from one of the tasks we gave them. So this is 75 participants, 35 older adults and 40 young adults, and I'll show you the breakdown in a second.
I was just curious, as someone who does do aging research, in these studies, first of all, what's the age range of older adults?
Yeah.
And do they actually do cognitive tests to distinguish between healthy as well as pathological?
Yes, I'm going to pause you and I'll show you the breakdown of the older adults, and we do tests to show all that. So I'll show you that in a second. I'll give you those data in a second. But what I want to show you is this is just a task that I did, and I'll show you what this task looks like. but they do a theory of mind task and a control task. So this is just the age by condition interaction. And what you see is just increased activation. This is all driven by the young adults. So young adults are showing increased activation in things like the medial prefrontal cortex, which you see here, and the right TPJ, which are all really classic regions involved and play a very important role in theory of mind. And so young adults are showing more recruitment in these areas than older adults. And usually the way people have approached these questions is they do this approach and they call it a day. And that's kind of the level of how we sort of ask this question. We're really interested in kind of taking this a few steps back. So one of the things we wanted to know is that, what might underlie these changes? And specifically what I became really interested in thinking about was how can kind of using a network neuroscience approach help us understand a little bit more and give us more insight to what might be happening with aging. So if you think about network neuroscience, people often will talk about functional connectivity, both during task and during rest. So we know that there are age-related declines in functional connectivity during tasks that predict cognitive function. So this is data from Jess Andrews-Canna, and essentially what she's showing here is that she just looking at 2C regions here, and there's reduced functional connectivity during a task. As a function of age, you have age here on the x-axis and functional connectivity on the y-axis. And that functional connectivity is predicting things like memory performance and executive performance. So the better coupling you have between these regions, the better performance there is. But this is specifically during task. We actually, for the first study I'm going to show you, wanted to take it one step further back and look at what's called intrinsic connectivity. So this is what's happening at rest. So for those of you, I know most of you kind of know these distinctions, but there's this unique state where the brain's not actually doing a directed task and the brain is sort of at rest. And you can look and measure how different brain regions are sort of hanging together naturally and communicating with one another during this state. And what we wanted to do here was see that if that might relate to some sort of behavior. The data I'm showing you here are going to be data from a study that came out a couple of years ago in Neuroimage, where actually I think it's kind of a cool study where what they did was they had older adults do a memory task, and from that they defined two regions of interest, one in the hippocampus and one in kind of this posterior medial area is what they called it. And what they wanted to do was to see if these regions were predicting things like memory performance on the task, but they wanted to see if the functional coupling between these regions at rest actually predicted memory performance on the task. And what I think is really cool, so they found that it did. Spoiler alert, it does. So more coupling means that there was better performance on the task. But what's really interesting to me is it's showing you kind of at rest. So not when you're doing the task, but what's actually happening at rest when you're not actively engaged in the task, which to me suggests that there's something about this sort of baseline state that older adults might be in, where they're maybe just starting off in a different place than the younger adults are, and that may be then affecting their performance. What I think is particularly cool with this study is they actually also showed this effect looking at tasks that people had done outside of the scanner. So they looked at, I think, the logical memory, if you know that task, that is from the Wechsler memory scale that people will often give, and found that it also predicted, the connectivity predicted performance on that task as well. And intrinsic connectivity, this is going to be one of the many spaghetti plots that you'll get to see today. Intrinsic connectivity is just weaker in general in older adults than young adults. So what I'm showing you on the left is, again, these are data from a Neuroimage paper from a few years ago, connectivity for young adults and older adults. And essentially what you might notice when people talk about connectivity is that the brain has this tendency to sort of group into smaller networks. And these regions become a little more specialized in how they're interacting with one another, which is really important for them predicting things like performance on tasks. And what I hope you might see by looking at this is a little bit more groupiness for the young adults and a little more diffuseness for the older adults, which is I'm going to show you some other data looking at this, but I just want to introduce this idea that intrinsic connectivity does seem to be weaker. And there's some hallmarks as to what's happening with older adults that I'll talk to you about a little bit later. It's not just that it's getting weaker, there's more going on there. But this sort of weakening within the network is actually going to become important for thinking about how things might relate to social cognition. And what we were interested in related to this is particularly that this connectivity seems to get even particularly, the default mode network seems particularly susceptible to these declines in connectivity and intrinsic connectivity. So these data are just showing you the age-related decline in functional connectivity seems to be particularly pronounced, and they're looking at posterior DMN which is on the left, and anterior DMN, which is on the right. And what they're showing you is blue is age decreases. So looking at, it looked at older adults between the ages of 64 and 91, and this was about 300 or so older adults from a study that was done in Minnesota for a group of older adults that were just recruited to kind of look at changes in connectivity. But the older you get, the more decreases in functional connectivity you see, particularly in the DMN. And to remind you, this matters because what we're seeing, remember, in these tasks is going to be differences associated with age in the DMN particularly. So theory of mind really seems to rely on the default mode network in particular. So we were interested in kind of paring down how this might be speaking to these functional differences we're seeing. Yeah, Dylan.
I'm just really curious. So my really vague memory of aging research is that a lot of the gray matter activity is also localized in the default mode network.
Yeah.
So is this a sense that I mean, do we have a sense of what comes first, or
Yeah.
bad connectivity because you don't have the, these processing regions are impaired, and
Yeah.
it goes together, or the connectivity really is sort of important?
So that's don't be a reviewer on our next paper. No, it's a great question, and actually one that in a new set of analyses we're currently working on, we're going to try to control for the atrophy to look at that. So I don't have the answer for you. And there's not data that I've seen that really speaks to the causality of that. So whether, atrophy is going to be predicting weaker connectivity or whether it's weaker connectivity is predicting atrophy. I will show you though that there are some sort of hallmark changes in patterns of kind of how functional connectivity is working within the aging brain that I can't say it's due to atrophy, but it's actually diffused throughout the brain. So I'll come back to that a little bit. So the first set of studies that I'm going to show you was a study that was specifically looking at intrinsic connectivity in the DMN, but what we wanted to do was relate it to behavioral performance on theory of mind. So we wanted to see whether the older adults, whether they first had weaker intrinsic connectivity in the DMN, but specifically whether that predicted the performance deficits that we were seeing on the theory of mind task. And I've had an unfortunate conversation with many of you in the past few days who've told me that you've already read this paper, so just act surprised when you get there. Okay, to your question, and I'll give you a little bit more than what's on here. But the young adults that we recruited for this task, and actually for all the studies that I'm going to show you today, it's the same population of young and older adults. So our young adults are typically undergrad or graduate students. The range on this was 18 to 33. The mean age, you can see, is sort of more undergraduate-y. Mostly women, which tends to be kind of what we get with both the young and older adults. We give the mini mental state exam as one way of just making sure they're normal functioning. These older adults also did a couple of neuropsych tests, and I remember they did trails tasks. They did some processing speed tasks, but we have done a full battery of I shouldn't say full battery, but we've done, especially to a clinical group, but we've done neuropsych testing with many of our older adults before, where we'll give things like the Wisconsin card sort task, we'll give digit span forward and backwards. With this group, what we're doing is we do a health screening to make sure they're healthy. This also, you get a problem with the older adults that Dylan alluded to, that older adults tend to have bionic parts, which makes it hard to scan them. So the group of older adults we're getting is 61 to 86 years old, average about 72. And for every aging study I do, I think the mean is about 72 on every single aging study I've ever run. And they're a little worse on the mini mental, but they're still all 26 is the cutoff if you don't use the mini mental for normal functioning. So the older adults we're getting are pretty high functioning in general. So these are older adults that are both willing to go on the MRI, which is a whole separate issue, which I'm sure as you've done aging, you've seen that there's a group that are willing to do it and some that aren't, and that are able to go on the MRI. So I'd say, just anecdotally, I'd say of every 4 or 5 older adults we try to recruit, about 1 can actually go in. So it's just, and we have a high bar. We have a 3 Tesla scanner. We have a high bar for this is just research, so we don't take any risks with older adults. So we have a very high threshold for who will actually let be scanned. The task was basically set up, so they came from 2 sessions. The first session, they did a long behavioral session, about 2 hours, where they do some neuropsych testing, they do a bunch of behavioral tasks, many of which I'm not going to talk about today, but I'm happy to talk to you about separately. They do the fMRI screening. We do this over the phone, but then if you've done imaging, especially with we seem to have this happen more with young adults, but when you actually, for some reason, you bring them in and the scanner's there and you ask them, okay, do you have any metal in your body? I know you said no. Oh, I forgot that I just had this implant put in a few weeks ago. So we do that multiple times with them, but they come in and do all that. And about a week later, we had them come in to do the scan. With the data I'm going to show you, we had 3 different fMRI tasks we used. One was a theory of mind task. We did 2 different face perception tasks. I'm going to talk to you about one of them. We counterbalanced the order in which they completed the tasks, but they always did resting state first. Resting state is eyes open. If you were curious about that, we did a 15-minute resting state. I'll show you the time that we have on these tasks a little later. This will be relevant. This data later. This took about 10 minutes, and this was about 6 or 7 minutes. And I'll show you kind of the breakdown of that when we get to it a little bit later. For most of the literature, you want at least 5 minutes to be able to look at functional connectivity. And we have more than enough for the data that we're going to show you today. If you care, those are the details of how we ended up actually collecting the data. And so all told, we had 75 people. We literally recruited every single older adult we could from the group that we had. And so we wanted to try to get to 40-40, but we just couldn't get enough older adults. So we got 35, which is still really, really, really good for an imaging study like this. Are there any questions about this before I go in? Okay. So I'm going to start by just talking about these first 2 tasks, and I will come back to this face perception task a little bit later, but most of what I'm going to talk about today is going to focus on these 2 tasks. So let me just show you what this task looked like so you have a sense of kind of what we were dealing with. So this is based off, this is a very common measure of using theory of mind. So Rebecca Sachs at MIT commonly uses this, and this is actually from her freely available data sets. So the way it works is you start by giving a scenario. So here our theory of mind task, Sally put her phone in her purse and left the room. Jack moved it to the dresser. Then they have a short delay with jitter fixation, and then we say, Sally looks for the phone on her dresser, true or false. So you're supposed to say whether this is true or false. So if you're making an accurate theory of mind judgment, you know that Sally doesn't know that it has been moved to the dresser. So she shouldn't be looking for it on the dresser, she should be looking for it in her purse. So the answer there would be false. So this is a nice task because you have correct or incorrect answers. The face perception task that I'll show you was more of a subjective judgment, so there's no right or wrong answer, but so here we can actually look at, are older adults bad at this? Because we know there are concrete answers, yes or no. The control task we had was a similar type of task, but it just removed this kind of mentalizing component. So here's an example trial. So a picture was taken of a house when it had 1 story. Since then, a 2nd story was added, and then you come to the actual prompt. In the picture, the house is 2 stories tall, true or false. So the answer here again would be false because the picture was taken when it only had 1 story. So this is an important comparison because one of the things that I often get asked about when you're thinking about theory of mind is maybe older adults are having a hard time with it because it's this working memory intensive. So I have this story here, and I'm just like, yep, I already thought about that. So I have a story here, you have to remember the story, and then you have to make a decision. But you have to do the same thing in the control task. So in the control task, I'm also giving you a story. I'm asking you to read the story. I'm asking you to think about the story. I'm asking you to retain it in your working memory, and then I ask you a question about it. So really the thing that should distinguish these 2 tasks is I'm asking you to think about someone's mental state here, and I'm not asking you to think about someone's mental state here. So that's the thing that I just want to point this out, and there may be other things that we can talk about with this, but I just want to point that out so the way I talk about these differences, you kind of have that in your mind. So let me show you first the behavioral results. So this is accuracy on the y-axis. This is going to show you theory of mind performance and the control task. The blue bar here is older adults, and the red bar here is younger adults. So a higher bar means better performance. Now, typically what you see in a theory of mind task is that people are better at theory of mind than they are at a control task. And that's what you see in this task. And one of the reasons for that is because, I shouldn't say because, one of the reasons for that may be that they're recruiting different brain regions to support this. There's a unique system that's set up to help support theory of mind. They may be better practice at these types of tasks, but this is a very common finding, that you'll see better performance on the theory of mind than you do on the control. I will note performance here is really good. So this is 90% here. So the young adults are really good at this task, and we actually had several who were at ceiling on both tasks. The main thing I want to point out to you, and this is what's driving sort of this trend toward the interaction that we saw in behavior, is that older adults are not showing that benefit. So they don't differ from young adults on the control task, but what's happening is they're not showing that boost on the theory of mind task. So their performance just isn't better between these two tasks when you look across the groups. And I'm going to show you the data this way because one of the things that working with Olaf is taught me many wonderful things, but he's really big on, he doesn't like data like this. He likes to see data like this. So he likes to see all the raw subjects. And I think what's really nice with these data, these are the older adults and these are the young adults. Now here what I'm doing on theory of mind performance is showing you a difference score. So I'm showing you the difference between these two bars for the young adults and the difference between the two blue bars for older adults. Except didn't I flip the colors? That was, yeah, I totally flipped the colors. That was great. So older adults are showing you here. So this is just what you should see is that the 0 is going to be no difference in performance. And above that means better performance on theory of mind, and below 0 means worse performance on theory of mind. And what you'll see is for the young adults, you have these kind of you have this one guy who did really badly on the control task, then just did better on the theory of mind task. But you'll notice kind of typical in what we see in aging is more of a spread in the data. So there's a difference kind of in the means in general that the younger adults are showing more of a boost on theory of mind than older adults. But you also see kind of more of a diffuse spread here among older adults, which is something that we see a lot. And I think something really important about understanding aging and what's happening in normal aging is that it's not happening, normal aging isn't affecting the same people in the same way. And I'll show you a few different examples of kind of the spreads that we see within individuals. But I think this is kind of an important thing that we're thinking a lot about, and aging researchers in general are thinking a lot about, is kind of what are these different variances telling us about what's happening with aging? Yeah.
Was this score in here, did you control for the actual age of the individual? Because you have a pretty widespread 61
We do.
days.
No, we didn't. That's a really good point. And I don't know the answer to that, but that's a good question that we should look at, because I don't know if it's that the older people did worse than the younger people did. The old did better than the young old. That's a good question. Thank you. I'll have to look at that. All right, so let me talk to you about how we measured intrinsic functional productivity. I know many of you do this type of work, so I'm going to give the very simple description, which is just to make sure that we're all on the same page in the terms that I'm going to use here. So when people typically will measure intrinsic functional productivity, you start by identifying nodes, and there are lots of different ways that you can identify nodes. What we did in the study that I'm going to show you here is we used the Yao parcellation. There are lots of other ways to do this, and we have some other data that I'll show you later on where we use kind of more agnostic approaches and don't train to Yao because it has its own issues. But what this ends up doing is that there are 7 different networks that have 114 nodes. We also include 14 nodes from subcortical structures because we had reasons that we wanted to look at the subcortical structures for some of the other tasks we're doing. So we had 128 that we were looking at. But then what you do, once you've identified your nodes, is you just essentially extract time series data from each node, and then you correlate each time series with each other. And what you're interested in is defining kind of what we call these edges, so the connection between the two nodes. So we'll hear me talking about edges, which is going to be just talking about how strongly correlated the relationship is between two specific nodes. Yeah?
It's just the individual continuous components of those networks, not just a whole force attention network.
Yes, yeah. Yeah, so we did this on the individual, yes, we did it that way as opposed to just collapsing across the whole thing. We do have some of the analyses we did that when I get to them, I'll point those out to you, where we did look across an entire network. But I have a reason for why we did that. So if you are interested in these details, these are the details for what you might want to know about. I don't know, this is not supposed to be there, I'm sorry. So we measure functional connectivity using the Con toolbox with Phil Gabrielli. We use these 7 networks in a subcortical network, so that's just those details I told you. We regressed out motion, so we use a toolbox that Sue Whitfield Gabrielli has to regress out individual trials that have motion in them. Older adults do move more than younger adults, but for each group we retained about 13 minutes of data for each group. There was a little bit more retained for young adults and older adults, but for both groups we had at least 87% of the data retained, which was about 13 minutes of data, which is more than enough to get a reliable signal in functional connectivity. What I'm going to show you here to your question, Dave, is for the first thing I'm going to show you is we calculated a network-specific modularity index. So essentially what this was looking at was something called Q, which looks at the sum of the edges within the DMN that are connected to each other divided by the number of edges overall that are either connected to, not connected to each other, or connected to something else. So what you're looking for here is just the probability that the correlation of within the network is stronger than within the brain overall. So there are lots of ways that you can kind of measure how well connected a network is. For this particular set of data, we used Q to measure that. And these are the data from the young and older adults. And what I'm going to show you is that intrinsic connectivity overall is a little weaker in the young than the older adults, the older than the young adults. And I'm going to come back to this again. I just want to give you a little bit of a preview of what's going on. So if you're not familiar with looking at these really scary patterns, we put it in two different ways to make it a little easier to unpack. So this is showing you all the individual edges, the correlations in all the individual edges. And what you're looking at is the diagonal, and sort of if it's darker, there's more groupiness within that network. So you can see the DMN network is right here, and so there's more groupiness here than there is around it. Blue means that there's sort of anti-correlations going into other directions, but this is showing you kind of, Olaf likes these because he finds it a little more visually appealing to see if you're not used to seeing these types of things. This is just averaging across the whole network to just give you kind of another vision of how well correlated or how strongly correlated the edges within that network are. So that's the young adult data. These are the older adults. We lost 2 older adults to motion. We didn't have enough data from them in this particular analysis to show you their data, so that's why they're 33. And you may or may not, if you're used to looking at these, you may or may not kind of pop and say, wow, that's totally different. But what I will point out too is you just see there's it's a little bit less dark on the diagonal, and there's a lot more sort of diffuseness happening throughout the older adult's brain. So you don't really see, here you see sort of more blue, but you see kind of this more diffuseness with the older adults. I'm going to come back and talk to you about why that might be. But the main reason I put this up is to show you that you get sort of less of this dark diagonal for the older adults than you do for the young adults, which just suggests that there's weaker intrinsic connectivity. So I just want to put this up to kind of introduce that concept, but I'm going to come back to this idea. So this is just showing you the same thing. So this is showing you within just the DMN. We're just going to focus here on the DMN for this study. I'm going to come back to the other networks. We're interested here in the DMN because the DMN is really what's specifically involved in theory of mind. So we wanted to narrow our focus to what actually made the most sense to look at here. And what we find is that what you're seeing here, this is just showing you the within network connectivity. So a lower number means less connectivity within the network. That older adults here on the left are lower than young adults on the right. So they have less of this within network connectivity. This is really consistent with other work. We did not invent anything here. We just replicated what many other people have shown is happening in the DMN. But the important part here was that the actual within network strength within the DMN as a whole did not predict theory of mind. So our main question here was that can we actually say something about these deficits in older adults' behavioral performance based on the intrinsic connectivity. And when you look across the entire network, you can't. So that's not actually predicting anything about what's happening within the older adults' behavior. But if you think that that's where I'm going to end the story, then you're woefully mistaken, because it has to be something, or else why would I show you these data? So actually what we wanted to do was zoom in a little bit more from the network as a whole. So rather than looking across the entire DMN and its 26 or something nodes, we actually defined a subnetwork within the DMN based on the theory of mind performance, based on the theory of mind tasks that people did. So maybe it's actually not what's happening in the whole network, but maybe it's actually the part of the network that supports doing the task that's actually showing weaker connectivity. And that might be related to the performance. Yeah.
Did you look at any other within network strength to see whether or not it correlated with your mind performance?
So no, we didn't. The reason we didn't is that we went in with the a priori of that we wanted to have, we want to be able to make sense of the data that we have, and I didn't have predictions about things like attention network or something having effects on theory of mind, and we just wanted to avoid getting in the clump of it could just be that you can find some story based on anything. I think what you may be getting at is the idea of, is it just they have weaker connectivity overall, and that's what's predicting it. I don't think with this study we looked at the whole brain, we just focused on DMN, but I will show you some data shortly that shows that the connectivity in DMN is weakest. So of all the networks, that's where sort of the age deficits are the most pronounced. So that's where we ended up focusing. We did do an analysis where we looked, we looked overall kind of to operationalize where the age differences were most pronounced across the networks. And let me show you those data when I get there. It was only 3 networks that came out looking at this in a slightly different way. But no is the short answer. We didn't compare to performance, but we did when we look. We find that the age effects are most pronounced in DMN.
Just to follow on one of the points here, the correlation that you report is across old and young adults. The R is 73.
Yes.
Right. Did you look at?
Oh, this is a T. This is a T-score. So this is just looking at this is during a T-test comparing.
And the second point.
Oh yes, you're right. You're right. Yes.
So did you also look at it separately? Because it's possible that young adults weren't showing it, but older adults are. And
I have something I'll show you in a second. It's actually not looking across the whole network, but looks at a specific edge where we do break it down by that. Yeah, and yeah, let me show you that. Okay, so kind of building up to this idea that we can look across the entire DMN, or we can try to kind of zoom in on the part that's actually the subnetwork that's actually supporting performance. What we did here, this was kind of a novel approach to thinking about this question. So rather than looking generally at the DMN, we decided to zoom in and look just at the specific level, what we were going to call these task-defined edges. So the premise of this is saying that if we're really looking at performance on a specific task, and what we're thinking with intrinsic connectivity is that what might be happening is that older adults have kind of these baseline deficits or weaker connectivity to start with that then might start to spill up and add to problems in kind of how they're performing these tasks. Then what we really should be doing is looking at the edges that are involved in the task. So to do that, what we did was we identified, and this is across young and older adults. So this isn't looking at just the age by group interaction. This is just looking across our entire sample. Looking at a main effective task. So what are the regions? We first defined the regions that were involved in theory of mind across our entire sample. And from that, we created a subnetwork. So this is showing you kind of one view of it. So NPFC, right TPJ, temporal pole, for instance, the superior frontal gyrus, all of these came out in kind of this broad main effective condition. And so what Colleen did was that she created a sort of subnetwork. And what she's showing you here is that these were the regions that are colored, or the regions that actually came out in the main effect. But the numbers here actually, all of these overlap with nodes from the Yao parcellation. So we get 8 different nodes that came out that overlap within the Yao parcellation that were from the theory of mind task. And we use those to create a subnetwork of 8 different nodes, I'm sorry. So these are the nodes that we have. So you have, for example, medial prefrontal cortex, dorsal medial prefrontal cortex, TPJ. And what she ended up doing was just looking to see if there were age effects in any of the edges. And you're looking, I hope, you're realizing at a multiple comparison issue. So she did permutation t-tests and then did Bonferroni corrections. And what comes of that is that you have blue lines, which are just showing you age differences where older adults were weaker than young adults. Red lines show you where older adults were stronger than young adults. And what you'll see is mostly blue. But all that matters are these 2 dark lines. Those are the only ones that survive the correction. So we have an edge here from MPFC to superior frontal gyrus, and an edge from right TPJ to temporal pole. So those are the only 2 edges that survive the multiple corrections. So I'm showing you the data here, where what you're seeing over here is you're seeing on the left, the older adults. This is just showing you the correlation coefficient here for how strongly coupled MPFC to SFG was for older adults versus young adults. And this is showing you that TPJ to temporal pole, older adults to young adults. And unsurprisingly, I told you there were age differences where older adults had less connectivity. So this is just showing you that, but showing you each individual. So you see older adults have less connectivity in medial prefrontal to SFG, older adults have less connectivity, and TPJ to temporal pole in young adults. But the question was whether either one of those actually predicts performance. So we took both of those and just put them in a regression and tried to predict theory of mind performance. And this is just showing you those 2 differences in between young and older adults. The TPJ to temporal pole edge was the only one of the 2 that predicted performance. So the NPFC to SFG didn't, as you'll see here from the regression, it didn't significantly predict. The TPJ to temporal pole did. And this is showing you the difference here. So for young adults, which is blue, having a stronger connection in this edge predicts better performance. And for older adults, you're just not seeing that benefit. So this is really kind of driven by the young adults kind of having this better edgewise connection that's predicting better performance on this task. And just to kind of nail this home, what we found was that that edge that I just showed you was the one that's with predicting performance actually mediates the age difference that we see in the theory of mind performance. So older adults who have the weaker connectivity in this edge are actually having worse performance. It's kind of what the mediation is showing you. And this is pretty, I thought, a very exciting finding, because this is the first time that what people have done is been able to say, can we explain these social cognitive deficits as a function of what's happening, these age-related changes in intrinsic connectivity. So we were really excited that we saw this connection, but although it's not a whoppingly huge effect, it's a pretty small effect. So the next question that we turned to was then looking at how intrinsic connectivity might relate to task connectivity. And the reason we looked at that is there's a fair amount of studies coming out now looking at kind of how things change between rest and task. So this is a study by Michael Cole and colleagues, and what they showed, this is with young adults, and so they had young adults at task, do 7 different tasks, I think, and then they had them at, oh yes, it's right there. And then they looked at rest, and they looked at the correlation and connectivity between those two states, and they found really robust correlation between the two states. So there they found a correlation of 0.9 between task and rest. So what our first question in this next set of studies that I'm going to show you looked at was that what might be going on with older adults. So these younger adults have a strong overlap in functional connectivity, and the reason that this is interesting and important is that overlap may actually speak to things like functional specialization and task performance. So our next question here was that trying to understand, now we're seeing already these deficits in resting state. So is that where the story ends? Is it just resting state? Or maybe is there something more happening in functional connectivity during task that can help us understand these behavioral differences we're seeing? So the same group of older adults that I showed you before, except rather than the 35, I'm looking at 33 older adults because you lost 2 older adults in motion on the theory of mind task. So we did the same thing here, but what I'm going to show you here are data where what we're looking at is the correlation between resting state connectivity and task connectivity. And I'm going to show it to you both looking at correlation between theory of mind task, and then we did a replication where we looked at it in the correlation in this face perception task, where they're just looking at faces, and I'll show you what the task looks like. So because now we're comparing rest to task, you have a couple of issues you have to think about, which include things like fluctuations in the signal due to task performance. So we high-pass filtered everything, and it's just to filter out task signals that might be at high frequencies that would confound our functional connectivity. This was in part, we talked to Rick Betzel, who's one of Olaf's former students and a new colleague here, who would be a fantastic person to bring out here at some point. He's a great guy, who insisted we do this because the literature's all a rage about this. We also regressed out task events. And the reason we regressed out the specific task events is that you get these spurious inflations in the functional connectivity signals. So we basically went for a really conservative approach in how we did this. So we may have lost some signal in what we're doing here, but I hope that the fact that we're going to see differences, spoiler alert, is still going to convince you that there's actually something meaningful happening here.
So
yes?
In essence, is what you're looking at during the task relations, is that just based off of the fixation periods, like the fixation blocks of your mind task?
Yeah, so we looked across the entire run, but yeah, what we're looking at is going to be just taking out, yes, so we're looking at kind of in the state of being in a task. So we didn't have enough power to try to tease out kind of what people were doing in specific types of tasks, but yeah, you're just looking kind of overall across them. So the first thing I'm going to do is show you the correlation between task and rest for young adults. So this is showing you kind of the same data. These are resting state data and task data. And I'm showing it to you both looking at each individual edge, but then also kind of smooth across the block. And there was a reasonably good correlation here. It's not as strong as what they see in the Cole paper, which is 0.9. We see 0.73. We have thoughts, the way they average things together was a little bit different than the way we did, and when we actually do it the way they did, we get higher correlations. So this is a slightly more conservative way of doing it. But the point that I want to make here is that older adults, you'll see the correlation here is much lower. So it goes from 0.73 between young adults, between rest and task, and 0.61 for older adults. But the question is there a meaningful difference there? So really what we're looking for is how groupy the networks are at rest and how much they're changing between rest and task. So are older adults showing more change between these two states than young adults are? And so I'm going to show this to you a slightly different way than the scary block diagrams. So what this is showing you is just the correlation for older adults and young adults. And what you're seeing here is the mean is the white dot, but then it just shows you the standard deviations as well. And when you do, so we did t-test, but we did compared to permuted null distribution, and you find that there's a significant difference between these two. So it's nice when you have the difference in correlations, but it is a significant and meaningful difference where older adults are showing less of this correlation between these two states than younger adults are. And I just wrote that down, so there you get to see it again. So I told you that we had another task. So this is a theory of mind task, and I told you we had another task that we gave older adults. So we wanted to see, is there something about theory of mind, or is there something about the rest task correlation switch that might also be meaningful within this other task? So I'm going to just briefly tell you what this task was. This is a face perception task, where what we had people do is they looked at faces of young and older adults, half old, half male, 128 faces total. 2 seconds each for the faces, and they were just asked to look at the faces. There was jitter fixation interspersed between the faces, and they just said, how much would you like this person on a 1 to 4 scale? So it's a totally subjective rating, so I'm not looking at behavioral performance here because this is just a subjective type of rating. I can't say whether this is a good or bad outcome. But what we did want to do here is say, when you're in this state, what ends up, how connected is this to what's happening at rest? And we have, you'll see we replicate the same pattern here, so there is a significant difference between the young adults and the older adults, but you'll notice the correlations are lower overall. One reason for this is this task is shorter, so it's only about 6 minutes total as compared to about 11 minutes for the older adults. And we lost a couple more subjects to that because we set a threshold that they had to have at least 5 minutes of usable data in order to do the analyses. And we had a little bit more motion in these tasks. We lost a few more subjects, so I think that's part of why things are a little less reliable here. But you still do see the same pattern, that older adults have less correlation between these two states than young adults do. So the next question is that why might that happen? Okay, so there are a lot of things that could be happening. So what? So what if they're showing less correlation between the two things? One thing that could be happening is I've constrained older adults to kind of I've been looking in the Yao parcellation, so maybe it's just that they go from organizing one way to organizing a different way during tasks. So they may still actually be really organizing the same amount, but just in a different way. So that's one possibility. So what we did was we took kind of a more agnostic approach, and this was one that Olaf and some of his colleagues have used in work that they've done to try to just characterize the assignment of brain regions to networks. So rather than sort of constraining the network assignment, we used a different approach that didn't do that. And all it was doing is just trying to identify how many subnetworks are there. Not when I'm saying what the networks should be, but just how many come out, using kind of the same type of approach. So we use something called gamma, which essentially is just a way of looking to see where you have the optimal kind of connectivity that would create a network. So it's looking, you can set it in different parameters, but it's a sort of free parameter that's looking to see whether you have a good modularity partition. And good modularity would be defined by you have large enough within module positive connections and small enough number of negative within module connections. So you're looking for things that seem to behave like a network. So they're kind of, you got more things talking to each other than not talking to each other, and that would define what a network is. So I hope as you can imagine from this description there, where do you fine tune that? So where do you say it's enough versus not enough? So what you do with gamma is that gamma you can set kind of across a range. We set it from 0.5 to 2.5. But at these smaller ranges, basically you're saying, tell me where there are two hemispheres. You're sort of grouping this at this really broad level where you're saying what group's kind of enough that it would basically give you a hemisphere level. All the way to 2.5 is so sensitive, it would basically say each node is its own network. So sort of the intermediate values are where you're looking to see really where things seem to be leveling out into some sort of meaningful separation. So all we're doing here is seeing how many groupings come out. And what you'll see is for young adults, the task is in green and it's in red for at rest. And you'll see that as is consistent, they have more of these little subnetworks when they're doing a task than when they're at rest. And that's consistent with what other people have shown. What's really interesting to me is that the older adults at rest are kind of almost like young adults at task. And then what you see here is that when they're doing a task, there's this really steep slope where this is showing you the number of modules that actually come out. And what you're showing is that they actually have way more of these little subnetworks coming out during the task than younger adults do. But just to give you kind of another way of looking at this, then what we did was we just took the difference between these two. So is the difference bigger? So I'm telling you that there's a significant difference between the correlations between task and rest for young and older adults, but using this kind of more just in the number of networks that come out, do older adults have more of these than young adults? And they do. But I want to show you first, just looking at, this is showing you the same data, but the individual results. So just showing you young adults, and red is red, red is red. Red is rest, blue is task, and older adults again, red is task. Oh my God, red is rest, blue is task. This is where Ken Fujita is killing me now. But this is showing you older adults and young adults in gamma. Really what I want you to see here is that kind of when you get to intermediate levels, you can see in general, I hope you see a few things. For young adults, it's pretty tightly grouped. You see a little bit of the blue kind of higher than the red, but they're pretty nicely grouped together in general. And overall, if you draw the mean, then what you're going to see is kind of what you're seeing here, that task is more diffuse than rest. For older adults, there's a lot bigger spread, and there's a lot of kind of, some of them are looking like young adults, where it's a little more tightly coupled, and some are just kind of all over the place. And I think this is, again, kind of going back to this idea of these individual differences going to be important things to think about of why are some older adults showing more of this dysregulation across these tasks than younger adults. But you can see kind of much more of this diffuseness for the older adults than the young adults. Now if you just take a straight difference score, so rather than looking at what might be the task versus rest, let's look within our subject population and see just the number of partitions that they have. And older adults are just showing you task minus rest. So this is blue is older, red is younger, and older adults are showing more when you just even constrain it, just are there more at task versus rest than younger adults. So older adults are just having this higher number of subnetworks, and it's just showing you those individuals again, where you're gonna see blue is the older adults and red is the younger adults, and older adults are higher. So this is again, task minus rest. So older adults are higher than younger adults, but just showing you the individual data as well. Does all this make sense? So this is just showing you basically the same essential thing that was going on with the first set of studies where we're just looking at the correlation between the networks, but it's showing you just using, maybe it's something wrong with how we thought about networks. This is saying just let's look at overall the number of things that are coming out, and older adults seem to have more than younger adults do. Okay, so what I've been focusing on and what I've been talking to you about so far is within connectivity, within network connectivity. And there's a lot of nice work. This is a review by Doug Wick, who was actually also a graduate student with us at Dartmouth, looking at changes in within network connectivity over the lifespan. And within network connectivity declines with age, and I've been talking to you about that already. And this is a nice study using kind of just showing you that you can see, if you look essentially at the colors, that you see kind of this less groupiness over the lifespan. So these are young adults, middle, early adults, middle, late adults, older adults. So you get less of this groupiness. This is visual cortex. You see that stays actually pretty well and pretty well defined over the lifespan. But these other networks that seem to be involved with kind of more of this ventral attention, ventral dorsal attention, frontoparietal, those are showing more of this kind of overlap and less within network cohesiveness over the lifespan. But the other part to the story isn't just that you're only getting less of the within network connectivity, it's you're getting more between network connectivity. So this is showing you some data where you're seeing for young adults and older adults kind of these little cohesive pockets for young adults, but there's a lot less of this cohesiveness for older adults. And people will refer to this as things like dedifferentiation. So there's more kind of between network talking. And those seem to have negative types of outcomes for cognitive function. So the idea of having, the whole point of networks is that you give these specific brain regions kind of functional specialization. So older adults are losing that specialization. And this seems to be true both for intrinsic connectivity, but particularly for task connectivity. So Gagan in this review paper shows kind of also nicely, this is across the lifespan, so the other studies looking at these groups, This is showing you from a cohort of people from 20 to 90 that over the lifespan you get this decrease here in this within system connectivity, but also this like increase in between system connectivity. So it's not just that you're losing one thing, it's that the brain is kind of reorganizing in how it's shifting information around. So the last sort of piece of this that we wanted to look at then was which networks, and this is a little bit to the question that I got asked earlier, like which networks are showing the biggest age differences in these disparities between rest and task. So to do this, what we did was we created for each individual, these are actually group averages, but for each individual we created a difference matrix where you just looked at task minus rest. So for each individual, we took these matrices and just created an absolute value, so not positive or negative, just showing you the magnitude of difference between task and rest for each individual. And we conducted what's called a network contingency analysis on this. So what the network contingency analysis is doing is it identifies networks with the biggest rest-task difference. There are a few papers on this, including by Olaf's lab. This is kind of a newer way of thinking about how do you define kind of where these differences might be. And the point of it is that what it does is it kind of yokes rest and task at each connection. So it accounts for the possibility that older adults might, in general, have just weaker connectivity overall. So to try to look at that, then you can zoom in a little bit and see where are the differences the most pronounced when you just account for the fact that they've got this overall weaker connectivity going on. So the way the analysis works is you just do a t-test between the young and older adults at each of the connections that you're looking at within the network. And we looked this, again, we were using the Yap isolation to do this. So the way that we did the network contingency analysis is we thresholded the t-values from ±2 to ±6. There was way more discussion that I would like to have to relive about why those numbers and kind of what's optimal about those numbers, but based on the literature, those seemed kind of the ideal places to threshold. And if it was greater than 6 for the t-value, it just meant the difference between the states was greater for older adults. So if you have a t-value greater than 6, it means that older adults have more of a stronger magnitude difference between task and rest than young adults. If it's less than 2, then it means that young adults have a greater difference between task and rest. And then what you do is, well, what the software does for you is you count the number of connections that survive that t-threshold and then just compare across to see are there actually a meaningful number of differences for older adults that meet this threshold that are greater than those that meet for young adults within a certain network. So you can try to figure out, is there a network that's kind of a subnetwork that's popping out and showing these age differences more than others? So I don't know how well you can see these colors, and my apologies for that. Basically, what this is showing you here, so this is showing you again with using the Yelp isolation, so you have visual, spatial-sensory, the dorsal and ventral attention networks, coming kind of all the way down to the subcortical. And if you see pink, which is going to be here, 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 and here, what you're seeing is that older adults had a bigger magnitude of difference than young adults in those networks. And blue is going to be that overall that older adults had fewer than young adults. You will see some blue dots, but if they're not shaded in, it just means that there weren't enough dots to kind of meet the threshold that we set to show that there was a significant age difference there. So we saw significant age differences that means that the magnitude of change between rest and task was higher for older adults than young adults in the DMN, ventral attention, and somatosensory. And those are the only 3 networks where we saw significant differences in those changes. And what I'm showing you here is just showing the average functional connectivity in those 3 networks for young adults, Mr. Green, and older adults at rest and task. And what you should see, sort of the pattern that's true across all of them, is for young adults in all 3 of these networks, there's less connectivity in task than there is at rest. And the same is true for older adults, but that difference is more pronounced. So at rest, in kind of these 2 states, older adults are a little weaker than young adults, but that difference is more pronounced for older adults than young adults during the task. And you can see that if you're looking at the t-values here, what you'll see is that the rest-task difference is significant for young adults between rest and task, but it's stronger for older adults. And really what seems to be going on here is, again, really driven by these differences for older adults between the 2 task states. And the effect was the most pronounced for the default mode. So that's where we saw kind of these differences, the strongest effect here in the default mode, where you're seeing the biggest shift in kind of how strong the connection strength is between the task and rest states. Does that make sense? So the last little piece that I'm going to show you is that, and this is kind of where we're going with these data now, is that I've shown you that these are different, and I made a big point of showing you with the intrinsic network data that it does seem to relate to performance. So the next place that we're going is trying to figure out how these differences might be meaningful to performance. So there's a lot of words on this because it's difficult to kind of unpack, but what we're looking for here is theory of mind performance for a higher bar means better performance. And then we're looking at the correlation between the rest and task states during theory of mind. So just now I'm looking, before I was looking at just the entire task where people were doing either theory of mind or control. Now I'm looking just specifically at when they're doing the theory of mind task itself, how correlated kind of is the default mode network with the resting state network, is the strength between those two predictive of performance for young and older adults. And what you'll see here is that for young adults, it doesn't seem to matter. Young adults are in red. And for older adults who are in black, the higher the connectivity, the stronger the relationship between rest and task for older adults predicts better performance. So the more consistently their network is behaving as it switches from this rest state to this task state for older adults seems to predict better performance. This is looking at DMN as a whole. We haven't drilled down yet to looking at the specific edges. So this is looking just overall at DMN. And what I think is an important thing to note as well is that you don't see that when you're looking at the rest and control task. So when the control task here is when you're looking at things like the house was one story in the picture, how many stories is it in do they see a picture with two stories in it? So you're controlling for things like, is it something about just remembering information and those types of things. The correlation between rest and control in this case does not predict theory of mind performance, but the extent to which those two states are correlated when older adults are doing theory of mind does predict their performance. So we're moving now in the direction of trying to have a better understanding of really what's happening during the task state for older adults. And where we're going to move from there is then how might that actually relate to the functional activations we see in the theory of mind tasks that people are doing. So there's sort of a mixed bag on whether functional connectivity actually relates to brain activity. Sometimes yes, sometimes no, not necessarily, but that's something that we want to try to unpack with these data as well. Oh, sorry, and this was a significant regression. I should have said that. Okay, so just to summarize what I've told you today, so older adults had weaker intrinsic connectivity in the DMN in particular relative to young adults, but it was really a weaker connectivity in the specific edge that predicted their theory of mind deficits. We also found that they have this weaker correlation between rest and task, and this seems to be most pronounced in the DMN, although we saw it in two other networks as well. And what we're starting to see from here is that thinking about what's happening in the aging brain, not just from the level of what regions of the brains are activating, but really how different regions are communicating and exchanging information, may start to kind of give us a better understanding of things to think about for how to understand how aging is affecting cognition kind of more broadly. I'll briefly just allude to I mentioned this sort of at the very beginning, but kind of thinking more broadly about just out of the domain of healthy aging, but thinking of things like pathological aging. One reason I'm particularly interested in this question is that this reduced connectivity is really one of the hallmarks of age-related memory deficits, so particularly if you look at things like Alzheimer's disease. And the default mode in particular seems really uniquely susceptible, or particularly susceptible, I should say, to pathology related to Alzheimer's disease. And there are several studies that have come out looking at this. So there are these consistent reductions in connectivity in the DMN that seem to be related to Alzheimer's disease. And there's increases in amyloid deposition and decreased glucose metabolism, which are early hallmarks of Alzheimer's within this network. So the population I'm working with right now are healthy older adults. But I think understanding what's happening in the default mode and how that might relate to behavior may also be really important for understanding things like early signs of Alzheimer's risk. And I find this review paper really compelling, where what they're doing here is they're looking at these differences with where you have kind of these early pathological symptoms of Alzheimer's disease in these preclinical phases where you're having a possible buildup of amyloid plaques, but a miss. So even before anyone's expressing clinical symptoms, they're already developing the pathology. And we don't have good ways of capturing that. So there's some evidence, this is kind of where, this study is a few years old now, but PET and resting state imaging have really tried to move in the domain of saying, can we capture this population? Because unfortunately, where we are now with medication and with kind of the trajectory of the disease is once you get here, it's kind of too late to do very much. So what a lot of people have become interested in is identifying people in this stage and seeing if you can push this stage back in any way. And actually, there's a lot of really compelling studies showing that if you even push back the onset of symptoms anywhere from 3 to 5 years, it's savings of billions of dollars, and it's also huge differences in quality of life for people. So can we do things to kind of use these techniques and think about what's happening on the network neuroscience level, but particularly how it might be relating and helping us understand behavior that might help us kind of try to get better insights in some of these kind of larger risks and risk factors that older adults face kind of sooner. So with that, I just want to thank my collaborators, the undergrads who helped us collect all of our data, our funding sources, and our imaging facility. And thank you all very much for your time.
So, great talk, and as you were going through this, and I'm still trying to think about what the rest and the versus the task actually probably means.
Yeah.
But I'm wondering if you had a chance to look at, so you have a pretty long rest state scan.
Yes.
So you could break it up into two, and then look at within subject correlations between those two to get a measure of how well correlated within, like how reliable is the rest.
I see what you mean. Yeah.
For older adults versus young.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, because if it's changing kind of over the span of the 10 or 15 minutes, then you can have kind of those changes later on driving some of these effects. Yeah, that's a good question. We haven't thought about that, and that's a really good suggestion for even just thinking about how good of a measure is this actually of resting state. Yeah, that's a good question.
To follow up to Zainab's point, the data is beautiful, and you're a champ for doing 2 talks in a day. I'm just conceptually trying to wrap my head around what's this coupling between task and rest, especially when you regress out the onset vector.
Yes.
Right? So what is, like, theoretically, it's very neat results. I think it's in line with what the literature has found in terms of the differentiation, and the analyses that you did with the subnetworks of older adults in the gray bar was pretty fascinating. But conceptually, what does that mean, like this coupling between rest and task?
Yeah, so conceptually that's the question we're trying to then look at with the next set of analyses we're doing, because really the question is why do we care about why that might matter for what's happening during task and or what's happening just in the aging brain in general. And what people will talk about with what's happening between task and rest is that in task, your networks do become slightly less distinct because they've got to communicate with other networks because that's what the task is demanding that they do. But there seems to be more of this decoupling with older adults. And what seems to be the case is that really what's happening is just less groupiness at all and more kind of talking to everybody in general. What I don't know, and I think is the question that you're getting at, is that why might that matter for performance, and why might that, is it really something driven about everything's falling apart in task and that's really what's driving a lot of these age differences, or is it just that older adults are kind of doing tasks differently? And there's a lot of work on aging, of course, that talks about compensation, and older adults are just using different brain regions in general to try to perform the same types of tasks. And I don't have the answer yet for the question that you're asking, but the question you're asking is exactly the question we want to answer, is that what does it mean that they're having these differences? So does it mean that this is really what's driving kind of age differences, or does it just mean that their brains are kind of doing the same thing, but in different ways?
I think more so what I am confused about is why regress the task on the onset vectors. Because if it's about task, saying that is, the perturbation that we're making in this more baseline state of connectivity, and then what we're interested in seeing is the coupling between this more intrinsic, for lack of a better word right now, this intrinsic connectivity and the perturbations that happen as a result of task, and then that's the coupling that we're interested in.
Yes.
Why regress the task variables out?
It was an overly conservative way of approaching it, and the reason is that the costs were higher than the benefits, because what happens during the task is that just by nature of the signal, you're getting a spike in that's not necessarily about the functional connectivity. It's a spike in the activation that then may look like it's increases in functional connectivity, but it's not actually. So we regressed it out based on just, there's enough literature coming out that we were afraid that reviewers were going to just kill us for that and say that we were confounding this coupling that we're seeing with actually just stuff that's not even related to coupling, it's just related to activations to the task. So we could try to just get at that noise and kind of clean out the other stuff. And we haven't done the analysis looking at just what's happening when you don't regress out the task. But we did that because there just was enough reason to not want to have a false positive and say that it's really this when it was actually something related to the task. I totally hear what you're saying, because it's something I really struggled with for a while too, is that like, this is what we really care about. But on the broader level, what we care about is just, because we're not really even focusing on task A versus task B in the rest task correlations. We're just looking when you're kind of in a state where you're doing a task. What I'd like to see would be looking at breaking it down to specific types of tasks, but we didn't have enough data to be able to do that well. And then not have to have these confounds, because I have the same concern you do. It seems like we're losing a lot of good stuff by having done that. But it was just based solely out of a concern of getting accused of just inflating our numbers because of something not at all related to connectivity, but just related to increases because of the noise in the task. Yeah.
In the correlations where you see the correlation with behavior and see this correlation with blocks where you do theory of mind and versus blocks where I'm just doing the control task. And there you're not regressing out task-based signal, or
no. No, I don't think so. But those are preliminary. Those are preliminary analyses that are kind of going to this next direction of looking at what's actually happening. And actually, I answered that. I'm not 100% sure she regressed out task. I think she might have, but I'm not actually sure if she did in that. So, yeah.
Related to that, if you look at the T-stats for like your mind task, does that relate to your mind performance?
If you look at the T-stats when you're doing in the actual task itself?
Yeah, false belief versus false belief.
So if you're looking just at the activation in those, actually haven't done that analysis, which I did realize until this week when I was talking to my student about it, and that's actually what she's going to be doing as part of the last part of her dissertation. So, because that seems like the obvious thing. I just assumed it. Of course we've done that because that's the obvious thing. No, actually, we haven't done that yet. So that's the next thing that she's doing, because does that actually relate to what's happening in the performance? That would be the most obvious thing to do. And there are a few people, so Joe Moran, who was at Harvard for a while, working with Jason Mitchell, did a theory of mind study with older adults where he found medial prefrontal cortex was less activated when older adults did theory of mind. He did look to see the predictive behavior and he didn't find it, but he only had 17 older adults in that task, so that could have been kind of a power issue. So I don't know, but then sort of really what I want to know is that kind of what matters the most and how much do each of these pieces matter. So is it kind of the resting state connectivity? Is it the task-based connectivity? Is it kind of how they're changing between the two, or is it actually the activation during the task itself? And what's interesting to me is that the edges that I showed you are the same regions that come out. Actually, I think I have it in the ANOVA that we have. So the edges that we had from the resting state connectivity were MPFC to SFG and TPJ to temporal pole, and that's actually what comes out for the activation of the GLM when you do the ANOVA. So this is where I was looking at this. So which of these then predict behavior, and that's something that we've done that analysis yet. So so that's the next thing that I want to obviously do. Dylan? Oh. Why don't you go first? Okay.
Do you think there are any special considerations that need to be made with the default mode network generally? Because we're looking at theory of mind tasks, which are included in that same default mode network, right? But if we're looking between resting state and task-based, and often the default mode network is default mode, it's being sort of a task negative activation. Do you think that just the nature of the network itself might be driving some of these larger differences in addition to the aging effects of the default mode network? But we're looking at tasks, theory of mind, in sort of a task negative.
Yes, we do see similar patterns when we do this with a face perception task, which isn't just a theory of mind task and would be kind of a different type of network. But yes, it could be there. I think you have kind of these are the interesting sort of factors of the default mode network, is that it is something that's sort of task negative, but we're looking at how it's behaving in task. And I think there are some subtle differences there to think about too, is that maybe in some of these other networks, and it's kind of to your question about just the general connectivity within other networks, whether that's affecting performance, is that it may be the case that within these other types of networks that are more used to being engaged in tasks that there may be, and this is a very hand-wavy, but that those may be more active, may have an easier time kind of making the switch. But we see kind of with those age differences that we're showing the biggest differences between rest and task are not just default mode, it was central attention, it's metasensory. So I think there's kind of a lot more. I think there are more questions than answers kind of in what comes out from some of these data. Yeah. Yes, sir.
I'll ask my question, but we're out of time, so if anyone has to go, feel free to go. We're waiting here. But that's it. So, aging research is not my forte, but what I do know of the false belief tasks in high-functioning patients with autism is that one of the things they, struggle with those initial false belief tasks are difficulty with the executive component task. So the task isn't just a pure theory of mind task; it has these executive components, and you walk them through that and perform a lot better. So it makes me wonder in this case if be something similar at play. So it's not so much that performing toilet theory of mind tasks, a lot of theory of mind tasks, but the executive components they struggle with of sort of organizing the networks to get into a shape. I think that the answer is clearly at rest. The network connectivity is there, it's good, but it's there more than it is during tasks.
Yeah.
And I just wonder if it's tricky because a pure less executive theory of mind task has no behavioral output to prove that they're poor at.
Yeah.
But we can still run those anyway, just so that at least, I don't know if this is making sense at all. Like I said, aging research is important, but given that older adults struggle with executive function tasks, maybe they have a hard time actually just organizing to create the appropriate, to formulate the strategies to actually answer this using the theory of mind network and match what they're doing. Or not that the network, but in and of itself is poor.
It could be, right? It could be kind of how they're putting it together. And I think this is where it's important to make the comparison between the theory of mind task and the control task, because at least for the some of those executive components, that those things would be consistent between those two tasks. But it could just be, it's just something about how they're organizing in general during tasks that they're not good at doing. But I think that's an interesting question. Is it that they just can't really reorganize how the network is going from that state of being in rest to being in task to do the task, and there's something fundamental underlying that. So it's that it requires some sort of, executive ability they can't do. But I think the fact that we're seeing that at least some of those preliminary data that the reorganization is predicting in the theory of mind is predicting the performance deficits, not during the control task, which takes some of these same executive demands in consideration, is kind of the critical. It speaks a little bit to that question, etc.
Well, if there's questions, we'll let Anne go and everyone else. And thank you very much.
Thank you.